we're going to walk through alignment issues or conflicts that come out of misalignments between you and your spouse. Tier 3 alignment issues would be where each spouse feels like they're competing over whose wants and desires are getting prioritized, and when conflicts happen because of those competing priorities. That could be things like whose career gets priority over the others, how much priority and accommodation is given to each other's parents or family, differences over discipline and parenting practices. These are just a few examples, but the core idea is when each spouse's values and priorities are misaligned enough to cause real conflict and friction. Now, Tier 3 alignment issues can veer quickly and easily into Tier 3 hurt lane issues because of how many hurt feelings can come out of those misalignments. So while a misalignment over whose career gets more investment, or how much in-laws can get prioritized over you, or vice versa, these are all things that can build up hurt and resentment within a marriage, making it really easy to switch into that hurt lane. But it's important to separate the lanes so that each of you know that you're dealing with two different issues that can tend to blend in together and create a pileup of issues and create more confusion in your conflict. So be sure to know if the focus of your conflict is on the misalignment part of the issue, or if it's on the hurt feelings part of it that comes out of those misalignments. Another way to conceptualize this is alignment conflicts are more forward focused. What are we going to do going forward? How do we make sure that we're on the same page so conflicts don't keep happening again and again? Whereas hurt conflicts are more past focused. They focus more on hurts that have already happened. So resolving past hurts doesn't mean that you're necessarily on the same page going forward. And likewise, resolving misalignments going forward doesn't necessarily mean that you've done enough to address past hurts. These are two separate issues that require individualized and special attention. Remember, don't bite off more than you can chew here and switch lanes in mid-conflict. Doing less is better when it comes to this level of complexity. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is lay out 3 principles that I tend to look for when helping couples through their alignment conflicts. Now, these are things that sit on top of those pitching and catching skills that you already have learned and covered in previous chapters, so make sure you remember to integrate those as well. That's your foundation for constructive communication. Again, we're just building on top of that foundation. So the first principle that I really try to establish when talking couples through these kinds of misalignments is to secure home base first. And home base is your marriage. Unity and oneness is absolutely critical and essential for the health of any marriage, and even more so for a couple to be able to do things that they want beyond the marriage. In other words, if your spouse doesn't feel secure in the unity of the marriage or vice versa, things like raising kids, advancing career, involving parents in your life, or pursuing other various goals is going to be extremely difficult. On the other hand though, if you and your spouse are on the same page and feel like you're one team, then you have a lot of what I call relational equity to be able to pull off and do some really aggressive moves to achieve your goals and wants, simply because there's a lot more trust to leverage in the marriage when there's a strong sense of oneness and unity. So my general framework and philosophy when it comes to securing home base is marriage first, kids second, work or extended family in third or fourth, depending upon what's important to both of you. Now, I'm more flexible on that third spot, but I'm an absolute stickler when it comes to marriage and then kids being prioritized over everything else. The one caveat that I have though is there's one thing that I would actually place in higher priority over your marriage. And that might look a little bit different depending upon what your beliefs are. If you're spiritual, religious, or more specifically a Christ follower like I am, then your relationship with God is going to take the highest priority. And the reason why I say that is because if you believe in God, higher power, Jesus, whatever religious background that you come from, it's first and foremost important to feel unified and one in your relationship with God. That unity you feel with God is important to secure first because it'll influence and inform what prioritizing and creating unity with your other relationships and responsibilities is going to look like. Now, if you're not religious or spiritual, then I'd still say your self-care, your core identity and health takes priority over your marriage and family. And the simple way to explain why is if you're not healthy and right, there's no way your marriage or any other area of your life can be healthy or right either. Two halves don't make a whole when it comes to marriage. For a marriage to truly be successful and healthy, you need two whole and healthy people to make a bigger and better whole together. So the best way to think about this is laying foundations that help you to not only build higher and bigger, but to also weather tougher storms throughout life. First, lay a strong foundation of your own identity and strength. That might be in the context of your faith. That might mean just being an overall healthy human being. The second layer of that foundation is going to be your marriage. If two strong and healthy people come together and can be aligned and unified, that creates an even stronger foundation to build off of. From there, you can build up. The stronger the foundation, the bigger and the higher that you can go. That might mean multiple kids, taking care of parents, advancing career goals, whatever. But if the foundation is weak, if you've not created unity and stability in your marriage or your own personal sense of self, it'll be extremely hard to build or advance in much of any other area of life. So if you find that you're deeply misaligned and frustrated with your spouse because of the conflicts that come out of these misalignments, then it might be that you're trying to write checks to achieve certain wants or goals in your life that your marriage doesn't have the relational equity or unity to cash. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't ever be able to acquire or achieve the things that you want in life, just that you have to slow down, go back and strengthen the foundation in your marriage to be able to do it. So if principle 1 of securing home base is in place, the next question is, how do you do that when there are already some potentially deep-seated misalignments that have caused maybe quite a bit of heartache in the marriage? And I found that the answer to that question lies in the second principle of empathy and compassion over truth and right. What I mean by this is if you prioritize convincing your spouse to see things your way first, or if you prioritize the want and need to get things done or to do things your way now, then you're sacrificing unity and oneness in order to do that. On the other hand, though, if you prioritize empathizing with your spouse, if you focus on creating a compassionate space for your spouse to feel heard and understood, then you build up that relational equity that you'll need in order to cash in and do more and to be heard more later on. Think about it like financial investing, for example. If you're wise and invest $100 of empathy and compassion instead of taking a $10 withdrawal to push for your agenda, you'll eventually get $1,000 of equity that you can use later on to make your point, argue for your perspective, and possibly even win your spouse over to your way of thinking. But this takes a lot of discipline to really invest and prioritize giving empathy and compassion over getting your version of truth and desired results out first. One of the most common examples that I'll see that proves this principle is when one spouse wants to be able to do more with their parents or family of origin and to have them more involved in their lives, while the other spouse feels threatened and deprioritized when it comes to their in-laws. When conflicts occur out of this misalignment, the spouse that wants their family more accepted and involved feels compelled to fight for their wants and to change their spouse's perspective. Something like, oh, my mom didn't mean it that way, you're just being overly sensitive. Something like that is typically a move to prioritize their version of reality and truth and a move to get the results or outcome that they're hoping for. But every time they do, they're taking a $10 withdrawal on that relational equity. But if they can invest $100 up front, first to secure that home base by creating unity and oneness with their spouse, offering lots of empathy, hearing them out, and validating what they think and feel, then that $100 investment that is much harder to be disciplined to do on the front end becomes $1,000 worth of relational equity that can be cashed in later. When I counsel couples to do this better and more consistently, the spouse that feels threatened and deprioritized usually ends up feeling much more willing to overlook and even accommodate their spouse's desires. In the world of investing, there's a saying that cash is king. In the relational world, what I'm saying here is unity is king. If unity and oneness can be created through things like empathy, validation, and compassion, rather than trying to convince your spouse of what you think is true and getting them to buy into what you want, then you'll find that making moves and getting closer to your wants becomes a whole lot easier. So just remember, invest $100 of understanding up front rather than trying to take a $10 withdrawal to have things done your way, and you'll get much further on the alignments that you'll need in your marriage. Now, in one of the previous chapters, we covered a concept known as meta conflicts, which are basically safe and structured conflicts that you intentionally have about the way you have conflicts. The meta conflict sets the tone and principles for how conflicts are going to go moving forward. Essentially, it's a fight about how to fight. Now, in a similar way, the third principle that I'll present here is the meta alignment, and it's basically an intentional alignment conversation that establishes how alignments will go moving forward in the marriage. It's aligning on how you align. Let me explain what I mean. Part of having alignment conversations involves each spouse sharing their own priorities, while at the same time validating and affirming their spouse's priorities as well. So what this comes down to is how a couple shares power in the relationship to have their wants heard and respected. Or in other words, how a couple weights the value and importance of each person's voice in the relationship. If there is a misalignment or confusion between husband and wife over how power is distributed or shared, that makes resolving conflicts over misalignments extremely difficult. Let me give you an example of how this works. Let's say life is like driving a car. A lot of the metaphors that we're using here in this course involve cars and traffic, so that's not big of a stretch. But let's say that you and your spouse drive down the highway of life. You have to be on the same page in terms of who's behind the wheel, who's navigating, and how much power or say does each person have in where the car actually goes. Now, if a couple isn't unified, if home base isn't secured, what you end up getting are two people fighting over that wheel and driving erratically, sometimes even destructively all over the road. But even being unified can mean different things, and if a couple isn't aligned on how to share the wheel, it can create major issues in the marriage. So some couples have static roles, meaning one person is always a driver or the ultimate decision maker, while the other person helps in the passenger seat. That might mean that the passenger has input to help navigate and give directions, but ultimately the driver is the one who will choose which way to go. So when I say that these roles are static, what I mean is that it's always the same spouse that's behind the wheel and the same spouse that's navigating. So just so you know, this is what's known as the complementarian model or traditional model for marital roles in a marriage. And typically what that means is the husband is the head of the house and in the driver's seat, while the wife helps navigate in the passenger seat. This is a very traditional model that many couples will still employ. But then there's also what's known as the egalitarian model, where the driver switches depending upon the issue or the terrain of the road. So one spouse might be the driver on issues of finance, while the other spouse is a driver on issues of parenting. This model allows for the couple to share power more based on who's the better expert in a particular field. But it requires a lot of mutual trust and unity to be able to pull that off. For one person to take control in one area and then completely trust their spouse in another area requires a great deal of trust and respect, especially when they don't necessarily agree with the decisions that they might make. So the idea behind this principle is being on the same page and aligned with your spouse on the kind of model that you're using, which in turn defines how you both share power on all the most important issues and areas in life. The key questions to sort out here are: 1. Who's a driver and who's a navigator? 2. Do these roles change depending upon the situation, or is it the same no matter what? 3. What kind of power does each role have? 4. Regardless of who is in what role, how do each of you ensure unity so that there is enough relational equity for the passenger to trust the driver? And then 5. If there isn't trust to allow your spouse to make decisions and to take the steering wheel, then why not? The answer to that question will tell you where you're misaligned with your spouse. One other thing to consider here is that it helps a whole lot to have a common vision that transcends each person's role, or a GPS to stretch out our metaphor a little bit more. If both of you have created a common purpose or vision for certain issues, the way that you were asked to and challenged to in that last chapter on Tier 2 alignments, then each of you have, in a sense, plugged your destination into your GPS together. And at that point, it's easier to trust the driving process since each person's vision and wants have been heard and respected. Who's driving becomes a lot less about who has power and more about who's entrusted to follow that GPS to get to the ultimate destination. Remember, at the end of the day, the biggest issue here is maintaining and building unity to secure that home base so that it always feels like you and your spouse are on that same team. If you can do that while managing these 3 principles, you'll be in a lot better shape to resolve misalignments in your marriage and be able to build equity, the equity that you need in order to be able to do the things that you want to in life. Now, some things to watch out for when dealing with misalignments is what I call hijacking and stonewalling. Hijacking happens when a spouse makes decisions or takes over power and control by acting unilaterally and without the other person's consent. Stonewalling happens though when a spouse refuses to give their consent, but more importantly, when they refuse to have conflicts or conversations to get alignment. Nothing that's said will make a stonewalling partner budge, so to speak. Both maneuvers are indications that power isn't being shared appropriately. Both violate those 3 principles that we just covered and is a surefire way to bankrupt the relational equity in your marriage over time. Okay, that's it for this chapter on conflicts that stem from misalignments in your marriage. Now in this chapter, we started off with a basic rhythm or cadence for how we want to see your fights go. That cadence helps to make sure that you prepare for and set up your conflicts well, and that you create a rhythm of speaking and pausing to listen well as you use all the tools and structures that you've learned up to this point. Then we dug into a few main principles for tackling these misalignments. Principle 1 is securing home base by prioritizing your marriage over just about every other aspect of your life. Principle 2 is prioritize validating and empathizing over being heard and getting things done your way. Principle 3 is making sure you're both on the same page about how each of you will share power and respect each other's voice as you figure out how to get on the same page. If you do these 3 principles well, you should be amassing large amounts of relational equity that will help you immensely later on when you need to cash in and make some key decisions, because your spouse will simply trust you and feel respected by you a whole lot more. Make sure you go through the exercises and case studies in the workbook to help you really nail down these concepts and get more used to them. In the next section, we'll get into Tier 3 hurts. Thank you for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.